I flew from Boston to Seattle this morning, 5.5 hours in the air holding an anniversary gift I'd spent weeks putting together. I didn't expect a grand welcome, but I did expect to be let inside the house I grew up in. Instead, the moment my shoes touched the porch, everything I'd hoped to mend cracked in a single sentence. My sister, Madeline, stood in the doorway like a gatekeeper who never intended to open the gate. She looked at me with that cold, clipped expression she perfected years ago and said, "You're not family anymore." No hesitation, no flicker of doubt. Just a clean, precise dismissal she knew would cut straight through me. Behind her, my parents stood shoulder to shoulder, their silence somehow louder than her words. They didn't argue with her. They didn't question her. They simply watched me, as if what she said was a truth they had quietly agreed on long before today. I didn't defend myself. I didn't ask what I had supposedly done this time. The answer lived on their faces. They had decided life moved more smoothly without me in it. So, I turned around. I walked back down those steps with the gift still tucked under my arm, its weight suddenly insignificant compared to the heaviness settling in my chest. They thought closing the door was the end of it. What they didn't know, what they never bothered to consider, was what I carried with me when I walked away. Within an hour, their perfect celebration would begin to unravel in a way none of them anticipated. Before I tell you what shattered that quiet room, and who finally spoke the truth aloud, tell me, what time is it for you right now, and where are you watching from? I'm curious how far this story will travel. Life in the Ward family rarely matched the polished image my parents presented to the world. They owned Ward Harbor Events, a company that managed waterfront venues all along the Washington coast. On stage, they were the charming duo giving keynote talks about leadership and legacy. At home, the rules operated differently. The closer you were to the business, the more valuable you were. Madeline lived at the center of that circle. She shadowed my parents at meetings, rehearsed sales pitches, and spoke about the company as though it were her birthright. I kept my grades high, managed the household whenever my parents traveled, and quietly disappeared whenever business discussions began. Teachers said I had a gift for strategic planning and should consider business analytics. My parents only asked one question: how will that help the company? In our house, ambition meant serving their legacy. The moment I wanted something else, the distance began. In my family, real success meant pouring every skill and every spare hour into the company that carried the Ward name. When I was 20, I rearranged my entire week for a company retreat at a mountain lodge, an event that was supposed to include both staff and family. I drove 2 hours to the meeting point only to find an empty parking lot and a short text from my mother saying they had left the night before because plans shifted. No apology, no explanation, just absence. A few years later, when Ward Harbor Events opened its flagship waterfront venue downtown, complete with a ribbon cutting, local press, and glowing speeches, I found out about it from an article shared by a classmate. The photo showed my parents and Madeline smiling beneath the marquee, the company logo lit behind them. My name had never been on the guest list. That was when I stopped waiting for an invitation into their world. I finished my degree in accounting, passed my licensing exams, and opened a small practice serving neighborhood businesses along the Boston Harbor. My parents dismissed it as a little side venture, insisting that real impact came from joining something bigger, meaning their company, not mine. The only time my work mattered to them was when their own system began to creak. A senior accountant left abruptly, and my father called, asking if I could help, just for a few weeks. He packaged it as a chance to prove myself. Against my better judgment, I agreed. Some part of me still wanted to believe there was a place for me that didn't require becoming a shadow of my sister. But once inside, the numbers told a story the brochures never would. Payroll reports showed gaps that shouldn't exist. Overtime hours appeared on early drafts and vanished on final ones. Time cards were edited after events with instructions urging staff to clock out long before teardown was complete. When I questioned these adjustments, I was told I was misinterpreting industry norms. Then I reviewed the relief grants the company received during the pandemic and the unstable years that followed. On paper, funds were earmarked for preserving jobs and covering essential operations. In the ledger, transfers quietly funneled into side accounts paying for executive travel, cosmetic upgrades, and perks that had nothing to do with staff retention. I brought a clean summary to a management meeting. The answer I received was slick: timing delays, internal reallocations, but the room went unnervingly still. After that, conversations paused when I entered. Emails began excluding me. I was introduced as family helping temporarily, yet the distance grew sharper each day. So I started saving copies, payroll summaries, memos, internal reports. I told myself it was prudence. And then, without ceremony, the assignment ended. "Thank you for your help," followed by a note about restructuring the finance team. I returned to my small office overlooking the harbor, where clients valued clear answers and didn't flinch when I asked the hard questions. I buried myself in spreadsheets and audit trails, telling myself the whole experience at Ward Harbor events was simply another reminder of how far I'd always stood from the center of the Ward world. A few days into my routine, an envelope appeared in my mailbox, thick cardstock, embossed edges, lettering so formal it felt more like an announcement to shareholders than a message from my parents. Their anniversary celebrations were always extravagant, but this year's event looked engineered to eclipse all the ones before it. I held the invitation between my fingers, debating whether attending would shift anything or merely confirm the distance that had grown between us. Silence didn't offer clarity, but something in me refused to sit out another milestone while pretending I didn't care. On the morning of my flight, I packed a small bag, choosing each item with the practical calm that steadied me when emotion threatened to claw too close. Jason, my closest friend in Boston, drove me to the airport, filling the ride with the quiet reassurance I couldn't give myself. I moved through security, boarded, and settled into a window seat. The hours passed with a slow, weighted hush, broken only by patches of turbulence and the muted shuffle of passengers. I kept my thoughts focused on the faint possibility that showing up might open a door that had remained closed for years. When the plane landed, the sharp Seattle air cut through the jet bridge with a familiar sting. I collected my suitcase and stepped into a rideshare, watching neighborhoods blur past the window streets where I had spent weekends filing paperwork for my parents, venues where my sister rehearsed her role as heir apparent. Each memory tugged at me like a thread pulled taut. Still, I wondered if walking into this night might rewrite even a corner of our history. The anniversary venue rose from the edge of a buzzing district, its glass exterior glowing warmly against the evening light. Guests flowed through the entrance in tailored suits and dresses, moving with the effortless confidence of people certain they belonged. I paused at the walkway, the small wrapped gift balanced in my hands, a gesture meant more for my own resolve than for celebration. Just as I approached the steps, the energy at the doorway shifted. Madeline stepped forward, framed by the warm lights behind her. She blocked my path with a practiced authority, expression sharp and unmoved. Her tone carried the kind of finality that didn't invite questions. Behind her, my parents watched from the threshold, silent and unreadable. No nod, no softening, no sign they hoped I'd come. The absence felt colder than any words. In that instant, the glow of the venue sharpened into something fragile, bright, brittle, and ready to crack. A strange calm moved through me, not acceptance, but clarity so sharp it felt almost physical. Years of strained conversations, missed calls, and carefully staged exclusions had all led to this quiet fracture. I finally understood that I could not push my way through a door held shut by people who had already chosen where I belonged. So I loosened my grip on the small wrapped gift and stepped back. It wasn't surrender. It was a deliberate decision to remove myself from a space that had never made room for me. Without hesitation, I turned away. The walkway felt longer than it had minutes earlier, though I kept my pace steady. Behind the glowing glass panels, the celebration continued, polished, curated, a performance of unity held together by the thinnest threads. I crossed the parking area and reached the street, letting the cool night air absorb the weight pressing against my sternum. At the corner, I paused long enough to breathe. The flight, the preparation, the effort, none of it had shifted the dynamic that defined my family. But walking away did something else entirely. It rooted me back into myself, a reclamation rather than a defeat. I continued down the sidewalk, a quiet resolve forming beneath my ribs. I didn't have a plan, not yet, but something in me had turned a pivot I had avoided for far too long. Before I realized it, I was heading toward a small cafe, nestled between two boutiques a few blocks from the venue. The warm interior lighting cut through the cold, offering a soft landing. I slipped inside, chose a corner table, set my bag down, and wrapped my hands around a cup of coffee that cooled faster than I drank it. The low hum of conversation filled the space, but my mind drifted elsewhere. It pulled me back into memories I had tried to shelve neatly out of sight. During my temporary months inside Ward Harbor events, I had noticed discrepancies, details that clung to the edges of my attention, like faint stains. At the time, I told myself I was inexperienced, overly cautious, imagining patterns where there were none. But now, with distance sharpening every recollection, I could see what I had tried to ignore. Hours quietly trimmed from payroll, signatures that fell too neatly into sequence, grant adjustments that shifted funds in directions never disclosed in the original documentation. Those red flags had always been there, subtle yet persistent, waiting for the right angle of light to expose them. One late afternoon, Monica Alvarez, a senior coordinator who rarely showed emotion, set a stack of payroll records on my desk. Her voice remained even, but her eyes held something else, a tension that didn't need words. She paused just long enough to leave a silent message between the pages. Something wasn't right. She didn't have to say it. I understood. From that moment on, every spreadsheet felt heavier, as though each cell carried the weight of actions that couldn't survive daylight. I tried asking questions once carefully phrased, voice steady, making sure my tone suggested curiosity, not accusation. The response from upper management was smooth, practiced, almost pleasant. Yet the room held a stillness that made my skin prickle, as if everyone present had silently agreed to pretend the cracks weren't crawling across the foundation. The unease didn't fade. It pressed at the edges of my concentration until saving copies of certain documents became instinct rather than intention. At the time, I couldn't articulate why. Now, sitting in the cafe's muted glow with strangers murmuring around me, that quiet impulse no longer felt like caution. It felt like foresight. The memory of being turned away at the anniversary celebration only sharpened the truth. Something inside me settled not with anger, but with clarity. Their silence had drawn a line. My response didn't need to echo their indifference. I opened my laptop, letting the familiar weight anchor me. The screen lit up, revealing the hidden folder I hadn't touched in years. Its presence felt deliberate, as though it had been waiting for me to finally acknowledge what it held. As I scrolled, each file spoke in numbers, signatures, and timestamps, payroll summaries that never aligned, transfers that carried vague explanations, repeated patterns that made denial impossible. I wasn't searching for answers. I already had them. I was searching for direction. A name surfaced with steady certainty: Alicia Park. Months earlier, I had read one of her investigative pieces, a meticulously documented report that exposed a regional company's misuse of relief funds. Her writing was clear, factual, free of theatrics. She aimed for truth, not chaos. That grounded approach made her the only person I trusted to hold these facts with integrity. I drafted a message brief, unembellished, attaching documents as evidence rather than justification. My fingers hovered for a moment before I pressed send. When the email disappeared from the screen, something loosened inside me. Not relief, not fear. Something quieter, a recognition that I had stepped across a threshold I couldn't return from. Minutes later, a notification appeared. Alicia replied, requesting a brief call. I stepped outside, the night air slicing cleanly through the fog that had followed me since the venue. Her voice on the line was even, measured, shaped by years of handling delicate information. She asked only what she needed to verify authenticity. When she finished, her tone shifted, not shocked, but purposeful. She told me the patterns were unmistakable, the evidence substantial, and she would begin confirming details immediately. When the call ended, I remained still, watching the streetlights flicker across the sidewalk as the weight of what I had set in motion settled around me. My breath left me in a slow exhale, the decision settling deeper into my chest. Whatever happened from this point forward would unfold beyond the walls of this cafe, beyond my family's influence, and beyond the version of myself who once believed silence was safer than truth. Back at the venue, the celebration had likely eased into its familiar rhythm, polished introductions, flattering speeches, and the seamless charm my parents perfected over the years. But the shift did not happen in an instant. It began quietly, a ripple before the tide. A guest near the bar lowered his phone with a puzzled expression, glancing around as if comparing the room to something he was reading. Moments later, another screen lit up, then another. Soft notification sounds blended into the music, forming an undercurrent that grew steadily louder. Conversations wavered mid-sentence. Laughter thinned. The murmurs sharpened. Alicia's article had gone live. Its headline was concise, its evidence undeniable. The screenshots, payroll records, altered time cards, and grant transfers all laid out with meticulous clarity, spread quickly through the crowd. I could imagine the scene without being there. Screens reflecting against champagne flutes, guests frowning as they scrolled through excerpts outlining discrepancies that no polished speech could outshine. People who had attended Ward Harbor events for decades exchanged looks no longer shaped by admiration, but caution. Some guests shielded their phones, reading privately. Others displayed their screens openly, pointing at dates, signatures, and transaction summaries with a mixture of disbelief and discomfort. The warmth of the venue lights now highlighted tension rather than celebration. As the murmurs intensified, attention shifted toward the front of the hall, where my parents and Madeline stood unaware of the floor tilting beneath them. A sharply dressed guest approached with deliberate steps, showing his phone with the solemnity of an emergency. Others followed, their questions becoming progressively pointed. Partnerships that had taken years to cultivate now trembled under the weight of doubt. No voices rose, yet the pressure was unmistakable. A few attendees stepped aside to make hushed phone calls, their brows tightened with concern. Staff members exchanged uneasy glances, their practiced composure slipping around the edges. Whispers tightened into certainty. The allegations were specific. The documents were real. The room was no longer controllable. Then, a new figure entered, a representative from the Washington State Labor Department, badge clipped neatly to a dark coat. Their presence cut cleanly through the noise. Conversations fell into an abrupt hush as the official moved toward the hosts with a steady, authoritative stride. And in that moment, the celebration stopped being a celebration at all. Staff paused mid-task, uncertain whether to continue arranging trays or step aside entirely. Guests instinctively parted, forming a loose aisle as the representative advanced deeper into the venue. A few members of Ward Harbor Events' management team hurried forward, wearing strained smiles that never reached their eyes. Their greetings were polite but thin, shaped more by fear than professionalism. Questions were asked quietly, firmly. Requests for documentation were issued with a precision that allowed no maneuvering, no charm to soften the edges. It wasn't long before the representative's attention shifted toward the operations wing, tucked behind the main hall. Doors were opened, storage areas accessed, digital records pulled up. 2 employees were taken aside for private conversations in low tones. Nothing dramatic happened outwardly, no raised voices, no confrontations, but the unraveling was immediate. The anniversary gala had lost its purpose. The room had transformed from celebration to audit. Guests who had praised my parents for decades now stepped back, distancing themselves from the growing tension. Some slipped into their coats and exited without farewells, unwilling to be tied to a collapsing narrative. Others lingered near the walls, watching with tightened expressions as the atmosphere hardened. Each attempt at small talk faltered into silence. Across the room, a catering vendor scrolled through the article on a tablet, shaking his head before dismantling part of his setup. A wedding planner, normally radiant with event day energy, shifted into crisis mode and instructed her team to pause all non-essential activities. Even the music, once bright enough to fill the room, now hung in the air like an intruder, mismatched to the brittle silence spreading through the hall. As the investigation continued, several guests lifted their phones to record short clips. Not out of malice, but documentation witnessing the beginning of something too large to ignore. The Ward name, long synonymous with elegance along the Washington coast, now trembled beneath the weight of evidence that spoke louder than any speech my parents could deliver. Nothing explosive was required. The silence alone was enough to split the night open. By morning, the blinds in my Boston apartment filtered in muted winter light. I moved through the space with slow, measured steps, grounding myself in the ritual of making coffee. My phone buzzed constantly, headlines multiplying with each refresh. Analysts dissected the patterns Alicia revealed. Local business forums debated the fallout. From the quiet of my kitchen, I watched the unraveling of a legacy that had always excluded me. I felt no urge to look away. Then a knock, firm, measured, intentional. My heartbeat didn't quicken, it steadied. I opened the door to find three familiar figures standing in a line, their expressions edged with exhaustion and something close to desperation. My father, Gregory, stood in front. My mother, Margaret, hovered just behind him. And beside them, my sister Madeline watched me with a rigidity I had never seen before. Madeline stayed a step behind my parents, her jaw locked in a tight line that revealed everything she refused to voice. I stepped aside only enough to let them pass an allowance, not an invitation. They entered my living room with a stiffness that clung to the air, choosing seats that kept them clustered together, as though proximity could reinforce whatever foundation remained beneath them. The tension they carried wasn't subtle. It clung to their movements, their breathing, the way their eyes darted toward one another before settling on me. Gregory's gaze moved slowly around the room, as if searching for something familiar, something that might soften the moment or make this conversation easier. When he finally looked at me, his expression carried a quiet strain he could no longer mask. Margaret folded her hands neatly in her lap, steadying herself before releasing a breath that felt practiced, controlled. Madeline remained rigid, her stare sharpening as if she were calculating every outcome before the first word was spoken. When they finally spoke, their words formed cautiously measured, deliberate, shaped more by fear than anger. They spoke of business disruptions, overnight phone calls, partnerships suddenly on pause, uncertainty creeping into corners they'd never expected to defend. Their sentences blended into one another, the cadence familiar from years spent smoothing over crises. But this crisis was not an external one. And they were unprepared. Beneath all their phrasing lay the request they could not bring themselves to voice clearly. They wanted me to reverse what had been set in motion. I said nothing, letting their reasoning fill the room, allowing the weight of their expectations to settle between us. When their words faded, Madeline stepped forward, the tension in her shoulders sharpened like a drawn blade. She reframed the article as overreach. She hinted at misunderstandings. She repeated that internal matters should have stayed internal. Every sentence circled the same center. The responsibility lay elsewhere, and the solution required my cooperation. The conflict they anticipated within me never came. The distance between us was no longer emotional. It was structural, built from years of choices they believed. I would continue to absorb quietly. Before I responded, a knock sounded a softer rhythm, familiar. When I opened the door, Tyler stood there. His usual neutrality was gone, replaced by a steady, grounded resolve. He stepped inside without hesitation, positioning himself in a way that drew a boundary as clear as spoken words. His voice carried clarity without volume. He acknowledged what he had witnessed within the company, the irregularities, the pressure, the silence he had once accepted. There were no excuses, only recognition. Then he stated his decision plainly. He was cutting ties with the business and the culture that enabled its choices. The reaction was instant, though restrained shock contained behind carefully composed faces, disbelief tightening the air rather than shattering it. The fracture had deepened, and this time, it wasn't mine to bear. Margaret's hands trembled briefly before she laced them together, studying the way her fingers overlapped. Gregory's shoulders sagged under a weight he no longer had the strength to disguise. And Madeline, always composed, always controlled, allowed the edges of her poise to fracture before forcing them back into place with visible strain. The room stretched into a dense stillness as the meaning of Tyler's decision settled across all of us. I felt no triumph, only a quiet affirmation that truth once spoken moves forward with its own momentum. When I finally addressed my family, my voice stayed steady. I made it clear the road ahead was no longer mine to shape on their behalf. Whatever came next belonged to them, shaped by their choices, not mine. They left without another word, carrying with them the realization that the foundation they had relied on for decades was no longer intact. The door closed softly, leaving the apartment enveloped in an unfamiliar calm, a calm defined not by resolution, but by the clean distance finally drawn between us. Weeks passed, the pace of unfolding events steadied, settling into a rhythm no one could ignore. 6 months after the investigation began, the consequences of Ward Harbor Events' internal practices had crystallized into undeniable reality. The company, once a polished emblem along the Washington coast, was forced to scale back operations. City partnerships were suspended. Longtime vendors dissolved their contracts. Bookings were rerouted to competitors without hesitation. Regulatory findings outlined violations with clarity that left no room for doubt, and the penalties reshaped the company's entire financial structure. The Ward name, once spoken with certainty in event circles, now prompted a pause, a hesitation that carried its own kind of judgment. Madeline stepped down shortly after. There was no announcement, no statement, just a quiet notice circulated among industry contacts. Rumors suggested the decision hadn't been optional. The demands of leadership had collided with the realities revealed by the audit, leaving no room for the authority she once commanded so effortlessly. For Gregory and Margaret, the fallout extended beyond reputation. Financial settlements required the sale of several assets, including one of their landmark waterfront venues. Their circle of influence contracted sharply, no longer buoyed by the confidence they once projected with ease. During the regulatory review, Monica Alvarez emerged as a key figure. Her cooperation brought clarity where documents had been altered or obscured, helping investigators trace the culture that had shaped the company's decisions. Her testimony wasn't born of resentment, it came from a long-held commitment to integrity that had been overshadowed for too long. Her courage became a turning point for others who had felt the strain of silence. And during those months, I focused on my own work with a steadiness I hadn't known before. The small accounting practice I once nurtured quietly began to grow referrals from clients who valued transparency, diligence, and the kind of honesty my family had always underestimated in me. I expanded my services gradually, taking on new clients who valued transparency over spectacle. Soon, I hired additional support, building something resilient not because it carried a family name, but because it reflected choices I could stand behind without apology. My world was no longer shaped by proximity to the Wards. It was shaped by purpose, by work aligned with my values, and by the quiet steadiness that came from finally living without compromise. But closure rarely arrives through distance alone. One evening, while reviewing quarterly reports in my office, my phone buzzed with a message from Margaret. It was brief, devoid of the polished tone she once used so effortlessly. She asked to meet. Nothing else. I considered ignoring it. But something quieter, something not rooted in hope, but in readiness, nudged me to answer, so I agreed. We met the next afternoon at a small park near my office. Margaret arrived with Gregory and Madeline beside her. All three carried an expression shaped not by defensiveness, but by exhaustion, the kind that settles in after months of facing consequences instead of deflecting them. They approached slowly, their steps measured, their presence subdued. The confidence they once wore like armor was gone. Their words didn't form a rehearsed speech. Instead, they appeared in fragments, acknowledgments of harm, recognition of patterns they had ignored, admissions shaped by accountability rather than pride. No justification, no reframing, no attempt to rewrite the past, just the truth, spoken plainly for the first time in years. I listened not to erase what had happened, but to understand whether sincerity lived beneath their words. And for the first time, the distance between us felt narrowed not by expectation, but by honesty. When I responded, my voice carried the steadiness I had earned through months of reflection. I told them I accepted their apology, but acceptance did not dissolve the boundaries I now held. Forgiveness, to me, was an act of release, not an invitation to return to our old roles. We parted without ceremony. They walked one direction, and I walked another, each of us stepping into futures shaped by our choices rather than legacy. As I returned to my office, I realized the real shift in this story hadn't come from the collapse of a business or the exposure of hidden truths. It had come from recognizing that loyalty without respect is simply compliance, and that stepping away is sometimes the bravest act a person can choose. If my story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Tell me what part of this journey spoke to you, or share your own experience of choosing yourself when others couldn't see your worth. Your support reminds me that stepping away from disrespect is an act of strength, not rebellion. And if you take anything from my story, let it be this: protect your peace, trust the truth you uncover, and never apologize for building a life aligned with your values. If you want more stories like mine, stay connected. Your voice truly matters.